Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the gentlelady from New Jersey for having this opportunity for us to come and talk about the root issue, as she explained, the root issue that caused almost the potential of DHS and that department having to be shut down because of the amendments added by this House of Representatives to an appropriations bill, a bill that should have been clean. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation, but amendments were added to it, amendments that were against the President's executive order, amendments that were aimed at undoing any progress that had been made with Dreamers, the DACA, amendments that were punitive in its entirety and did not seek any solution to deal with our broken immigration system. Thankfully, the adults in this House took control. A clean bill was passed with overwhelming and unanimous support from Democrats and with significant support from our Republican colleagues. That being done, that example should be a harbinger that on must-pass legislation critical to the future of this nation, critical to its tranquility, that we stop playing games with that legislation, and that the track to deal with immigration reform should be a track that we all pursue. But to try to put mean-spirited, divisive, got-you, grandstanding amendments on a piece of must-pass legislation, whether it is Homeland Security the other day, transportation in the future, that is not governing. That is merely pandering to a political ideology that has nothing to do with the underlying bill, as it did with national security. Let me talk a little bit about how we got to that situation, as the gentlelady said. In the time that I have been here, immigration reform and the broken system has been an acknowledged fact by all sides. There was an attempt that the Senate a year ago passed, a bipartisan bill, overwhelming support, that took us in a direction, a very critical first step to reforming this broken immigration system. For a year, we waited for the leadership of this House, the Republican leadership, to bring that bill up and let the people's House work its will. That never happened. And time again, we admonished the leadership in saying, if nothing is done by this House to allow an up or down vote on that piece of legislation that the Senate passed, the President will have no option but to relieve the anxiety, to relieve the painful family divisions that were going on in this country, and to prevent the additional community trauma that many of our communities were facing with the high level of detentions and deportations, the splitting of families, even when there was U.S. citizen children or a spouse involved. The President waited. He waited a considerable amount of time, and I was one of those that criticized that waiting period, that should be done immediately. But at the end, the President put the executive orders together, the expansion and enhancement of DACA for Dreamer people, and DAPA for those individuals, parents who have citizen children, that they too would get the 2-year umbrella of protection, could work, and could come out of the shadows. And this was not an automatic, as it has been exaggerated by the opponents of his actions. This was a process that requires documentation and that requires qualifications in order to be eligible for the programs. And as the President said, now Department of Homeland Security, ICE, Border Patrol can now concentrate on the smuggling and organized crime that occurs along our border. That is the root cause of much of the violence and heartache that we see on our border. In Arizona, there's been over close to 5,000 individuals that have lost their life in the desert trying to cross to the United States, countless acts of violence, and all generated by human traffickers, drug smugglers, and organized crime on both sides of the border. Time to concentrate on that very obvious threat to American security. And the other is to go after the people that we don't want here. Another exaggeration to say that this is blanket amnesty. It is not blanket amnesty. Far from it. We, like everyone else, the people that don't belong here because of felonious behavior, violence, drug smuggling, and breaking the laws of this nation, those are the people that I should put its emphasis on and get rid of felons, as the president said, and not families. So the president did that order, much to the outcry of some colleagues of mine on the other side of the aisle. Not all. I mean, I would never paint the whole Republican caucus with one brush, but there is a significant number that see the issue of immigration in a very different and clouded way. That clouded way has to do more with ideology. It has more to do with a sense that it's us versus them, and an insecurity about the change in demography of this country and what it means to the nation. And that insecurity is just that, an insecurity not founded in fact and not founded on the immigrant history of this nation. As a first-generation American, I can tell you the pride and the values that I have were grown in this country, were nurtured in this country, and serving in this body could be the highest honor I could ever have. That story is repeated day in, day out for the history of this nation, that the immigrant community has come to give and to contribute, not to take. And the president has wide latitude as president with the executive orders. Court case, an injunction to hold the implementation of his executive orders in Texas, where a selection process chose this judge for his previous legal opinions and his previous public comments regarding the issue of immigration that sided very much with the opponents. I am totally confident that as we move up the chain of the federal court system, that the constitutional authority that the president has for these executive orders, as have previous presidents had for these executive orders, will be redeemed, and that lower injunction will be overturned. In the interim, we continue to tell people in the undocumented community, immigrant community, come forward. Bring your documentation. Begin to prepare yourself for an opportunity to be one of the people and families that qualify for this program. What the president did, executive orders, is significant in many ways. Those executive orders mended the social fabric of this nation. One of the most divisive issues has been immigration, and maybe it is a good election ploy to continue to beat that horse dead in order to get elected, but in the long term, in the generational term of this nation, it does nothing but divide us along very superficial issues, divides us along the issue of race, and divides us along the issue of language and country of origin. Those are not divisions for the social well-being of this nation that we can tolerate. Immigration reform is also about the domestic tranquility of this nation and to heal that social fabric that has been ripped. I also want to say that the Progressive Caucus from the outset has been a tireless advocate for comprehensive immigration reform, humane policies, family-centered reforms, and reforms that deal with the reality of what is around us and doesn't ignore it. I'm proud to be a member of that caucus and for its steadfast and unwavering support not only of comprehensive immigration reform, but of the President and his executive orders. 5 amendments were presented as part of the DHS bill, which were the center of the controversy and the ones that were eliminated so we could finally vote on a key piece of legislation. One amendment, Adderalt Amendment. This amendment prohibits any funds or fees to be used to carry out the majority of the President's executive order, including DAPA and DACA. Reality. Fact. The prohibition is irrelevant and moot. All cost of this program comes from the individual making an application. It is a fee-driven process. There is no specific allocation that this body has made to it or that the department is making to it. The Blackburn Amendment, which I thought was particularly was of particular anguish to everyone. This amendment would end the DACA program, the Dreamer program, for Dreamer children susceptible to deportation. Let's say those almost 300,000, if not more, young people that are qualified under DACA suddenly, with that amendment, would have that protection taken away, and their status would now be back in the deportable status. That amendment in and of itself does nothing for national security, does nothing to address the issue of a broken immigration system, but indeed adds a level of cruelty to the whole process of trying to solve this problem. Preventing the president from being able to have new enforcement priorities, going after criminals and felons, as opposed to trying to break up families and deport families. One of the amendments was meant to stop that. The Solomon Amendment really made no sense. That undocumented people are not able and cannot receive and participate in the Affordable Care Act. Employees cannot register and have them employed, period, by federal law. It was just to state the obvious and try to create an issue in which there was one. And there is no prioritization where people under this executive order will be ahead of different processes. One is for a legal reprieve and protection that lasts up to the tenure of this president, and the other one, naturalization and getting legal permanent status, continues to be a process. One process doesn't get in front of the line of the other. I want to go back to one point and then yield back to the gentlelady. At some point, we're going to have to deal with the issue of immigration reform in a constructive, proactive way. And it's going to have to be dealt with because I think the economic security of this country is at stake. The domestic well-being and quality of life for this country is at stake. The economy is at stake and the security is at stake. And if for no other reasons, to look at the benefits of those areas in the discussion of comprehensive immigration reform. We can continue on the path of making immigration reform and immigrants the cannon fodder in the 2016 election. We could continue to make immigration reform the collateral damage in any piece of legislation that is brought before this Congress, with the assumption that the individuals affected by these laws are not real human beings. We can continue to deny the obvious and the reality of this nation, that when you have 11 million undocumented living, working amongst us, that the prudent, smart, and pragmatic thing to do is to deal with that issue and not exploit it or ignore it. We've heard so much pandering to this issue. We've heard the disease being brought, proven untrue. The young children that were in detention that came in that surge across the border 6-7 months ago, their rate of infection was no higher than the rate of infection for children throughout this nation. The pandering about terrorism coming over the border, not one incident has been qualified as fact that indeed that has become a pathway for terrorism. The issue that somehow it is tearing at what America is. I think this is the most important point that we should take into consideration. From many, there is one. It is the motto that this nation holds dear to itself, that all of us come here, and that by being here, we begin to form this union of ours, integrating the values, the aspirations, the rule of law, and the history of that nation, and making it one. To continue to pretend that we can have a two-tier society without consequences to the economy and the social well-being of this nation is wrong. It is wrong on very humane and just reasons, but is profoundly wrong on what this nation is and what I learned and all of us have learned this nation is and will be, continue to be. A nation founded on the rule of law, a nation founded by immigrants. I also want to say, and I'll say it as delicately and as carefully as I can, immigration reform, to many people that are citizens, maybe second, third generation, whose original folks were immigrants, that happen to be of color, that happen to come from a country of origin where the language and the culture was different from the mainstream of this nation, that have integrated fully and have contributed to the defense and the well-being of this nation, feel that the constant drumbeat of accusation, of it's us versus them, of division, that this issue not only is an issue of immigration reform for the people that need it and for the nation that needs it, but it's also an issue of civil rights, that no one should be profiled into a situation that they're less than someone else because of where their parents came from, because of the language that they spoke, or the country that they came from, or the color of their skin. That's not America. And we continue to pander to those emotions, fear, as a means to score political points and possibly win an election here and there, that we do it at our own peril. So for many generations of Americans that have served this country, the issue of immigration strikes us as an issue about our rights, our presence, our history, and our ability to proudly stand with anyone else and be as American as the next person. So with that, let me yield back to the gentlelady from New Jersey. Thank her so much for organizing this, and thank her for the opportunity of time that she's granted me to be able to state some things that sometimes the confines of our debates here don't allow us to. Thank you very much, and I yield back.